Hey everyone, welcome to Faith Talk, a daily series to help encourage you in your walk and faith in Jesus. Now, in today's brief episode, we're going to talk about theology. Now, theology is a word that sometimes we don't use very often in the church. We're going to talk about that today because actually, theology is super important for us to understand, for us to be aware of, not only to know, but to encourage us in our faith and walk with Jesus. Now, first, before we go any further, I want to talk just a little bit about what theology is. And simply put, the word theology simply means the study of God. Now, for our purposes, we're going to have like a working definition of why theology is important to us, why we should care about theology as followers of Jesus. And as a working definition, we're going to say this: theology is a careful reflection on God's revealed truths, especially from Scripture, so as to have a truthful understanding of God's character and of His will. So that's sort of a working definition we're going to use, that theology, when we talk about rightfully understanding God, is super important for our faith and for our life and practice. Now, a passage we're going to look at is 1 Timothy chapter 4. And I'd really encourage you sometime today to look at verses 1 through 16, which is the entire chapter in its entirety. But for our purposes today, I'm just going to look at just a few verses here from 11 and 12 and following to the end of the chapter. Paul is writing to Timothy here, and he says, "Let no one look down on you because of your youthfulness." So he's writing to Timothy, and Timothy was a younger pastor, a younger man. He says, "But rather in speech, conduct love, faith, and purity. Show yourself an example to those who believe." Notice what he says in verse 13. "Until I come, give attention to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation and teaching. Do not neglect the spiritual gift within you, which was bestowed on you through prophetic utterance with the laying of hands by the presbytery. Take pains with these things, be absorbed in them so that your progress will be evident to all. Pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching. Persevere in these things, for as you do this, you'll ensure salvation both for yourself and for those who hear you." Now, there's a lot here in this passage, and really, I want to encourage you, take time to read the whole chapter or even the whole book of 1 Timothy. But for the purpose today of us talking about theology, there's just a few things I want to point out to us. Again, theology as the study of God is really important, that we have a good understanding of God so that we may worship Him appropriately, so that we can follow Him in the way that He desires, and so that as we witness to others, we are representing the true biblical God and maybe not some misconceptions that people may have about God. So as we looked at this passage, a couple of things that I want to highlight for you that we observe. First of all, studying Scripture, having good theology, is actually prescribed and directed by Scripture. That here Paul tells Timothy, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to studying Scripture, to sound doctrine and teachings. Earlier in the chapter, one reason why he shares with Timothy to do this is so that he's able to recognize and avoid false doctrines and false teachings. Friends, the better understanding we have of true biblical theology, the more readily we're going to be able to recognize false doctrine, teachings that aren't quite biblical or aren't quite right. Maybe they sound really good, but they're not actually what God would have for us, or they're not a reflection of God's character and will. And the more we understand theology, the more we're going to be able to recognize that. Really, understanding theology, as Paul is sharing with Timothy here, is part of following Christ, and it's part of spiritual maturity, and it's part of witnessing to and teaching others about Jesus. Now, each day we'll have an upward, outward, and inward question application for you today. So with your upward relationship with God, I would ask you this: what does a good understanding of theology, how might that influence the way you worship God? Thinking about His character and His attributes, thinking about the truths of Scripture, of how Scripture describes and teaches you the character of God. regards to your inward relationship, that is what you do with this proper understanding of theology. How does this influence the way you think and behave? Does a right understanding of God influence your choices, your priorities, your desires? And lastly, I challenge you to think about this today. How does theology, a right understanding of God, influence your external or your outward relationships? Does your understanding of God and your theology impact the way in which you relate to other people? Maybe in the way you share your faith, maybe in your integrity and relationships. So there's the upward, the inward, and the outward relationship elements of what we talk about when we talk about theology and a right understanding of God. So God bless you today, and I'll see you tomorrow for another Faith Talks. Bye now.